and then you will be muted during that time. So don't worry, we'll unmute you the moment when it's ready to present. Okay, all right, we're good to go. Good luck. Break a leg.
Thank you. Thank you. Start.
Hi, everyone. Today, wherever you are, I believe we've got people joining us from all over the world today. And we've got a very special speaker with us today, Luani Tupas. But before we go into that, we'd like to share with you our faculty video, the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, University, Malaya.
I cannot hear. Yeah, I cannot hear.
And I don't want to waste the time because I know why you're all here online. So let me introduce a very distinguished speaker and my good friend, Dr. Ruani Tupas, who's joining us all the way from London. And I'll just tell you a little bit about himself because I know that all of you know him very well. So Dr. Ruani Tupas teaches sociolinguistics in education at the Institute of Education, University College London. And he is an associate editor of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language. And he has been honored with an honorary lifetime membership by the Linguistic Society of the Philippines for his contributions in language studies in the country. So we are very, very honored to have him today. So let me pass the floor, literal floor, or rather the virtual floor over to Dr. Ruani Tupas, who will be talking to us about everyday multilingualism and language education. How do we bridge the gap? So over to you, Ruani.
Hello, Steph.
Hi.
Thank you. It's so nice to see you. I miss visiting you and friends and colleagues in UM.
We
For
miss you
those of
too.
you who don't know, I'm a constant visitor at the University of Malaya. And so it's great to see you, and I would like to thank you as well as your team for for the really warm welcome and for helping me set up today's talk as well. So how do I say this now? It's just good morning, selamat pagi from London.
Yes, selamat pagi.
Hello everyone, and to all those who are attending from all parts of the world, thank you very much. As you can see, this is really pretty much. Can you put up the slides, please? My son is over here to help me, so is really a sharing kind of session. Because this is a part of an ongoing project that that I have been involved in for the past year or so. Um, for some of you probably who are following some of my talks and my publications, in newspapers and so on and so forth, I have been working in this, around the area of Filipino or Pinoy pop culture, but still focus on the kind of research questions that I have been involved in, that I have been engaged in for the past, at least 2 decades, which has got something to do with inequalities of multilingualism. So a few of my friends did ask me, have I changed my research focus? Actually, no, it's really just a different context, something that I think I find really very fascinating, because a lot of it has got to do with everyday multilingualism, and looking at a different lens definitely will make a whole lot of difference in the way we look at language education as well. Steph, can you see the slides now? All right. I hope the slides are now can now be seen. Yeah. All right.
Yes,
All
yes, we
right.
can see your slides. Go
Okay.
ahead,
Thank you.
Ruani.
All right. Thank you. All right. Okay. So just these are really some series of reflections that I have on the kinds of you know findings and kinds of observations that I have seen in my own work in this particular area. But just to give you a just a kind of background to what I am going to talk about. I am following P-pop groups in the Philippines. P-pop groups, basically Pinoy or Filipino groups in the Philippines that have been surfacing and evolving into really a huge industry as well. As you can see here, there are some, of course, groups that have, basically paved the way. As you can see up there, you have SB19. I did talk, and I've been following them for quite some time now. I will be talking a little bit more about them as well. but they are a very huge, hugely talented group of young Filipinos as well, who are, in a sense, paving the way for the kinds of music that's of course evolving in the Philippines at the moment as well. And you have other groups such as Alamat, such as BGYO, and many other groups as well that I have been following. I think the reason why they really are very fascinating to me is not just simply because of the songs that they sing, because I am not a musician. I'm not looking at all these things through the lens of music, in a sense, if you come to think of it that way. But I'm really looking at what, the kinds of discourses, the kinds of ideologies, the kinds of multilingual repertoires, translingual repertoires that they generate, when people talk about them. So I have stan accounts. I am in everyday dialogues and conversations online, for example, that are really, to me, really fascinating when it comes to language use. And I think this is the kind of information and knowledge that I think many of us are not very much aware of. Of course, I'm talking here about Pinoy pop, but we are also talking about all kinds of pop cultures that are emerging or that have emerged in our respective communities as well. In Malaysia, I'm sure there is one. In Thailand, I'm sure there is one. Indonesia as well, and so on and so forth. So that's where my interest is really coming from. Now, and because of that, I have actually been very, very involved in what you may call making sense of what's going on in these communities. You can see there on the slides, some of my titles are, these are titles of newspaper articles that I have written about many of these P-pop groups. I've talked about, the way languages are used. I've talked about ideologies concerning language as well. I talk about how media engagement, the use of multiple, language, discourses, and discourses in the way the young actually also engage among themselves as well. You see there also a screenshot of me. I think some of you probably would know Debbie and Isabel Martin, Debbie Pies and Isabel Martin. They have a radio program for teachers, and they also invited me, and I also talk about basically multilingual Pinoy pop as well, and its relation to language education. So I have been I must say, been involved really very, very closely with communities in these P-pop industry as well. And that's why, much of what I'm going to talk about here are my own reflections and observations, and hopefully, engage many of you in this particular area as well, especially with the use of certain concepts. Now, when we are talking about my engagement, I would like you to make, to be to remember this particular slide, because I will be making references to this slide really quite often later on. As you can see there, one of the groups, invited me to talk about language and the nature of language and dialects. There's one group, again, I will be talking about them in a little while, which is Alamat. They actually use, different Philippine languages, not just Filipino or Tagalog, but many different Philippine languages as well in their songs, in their music. And because of that, the kinds of reactions, the kinds of perceptions that people have of these languages have somehow generated really quite fascinating discussions, and that's where all of these language issues actually surface as well. So they no longer are, to me, academic in a formal sense, academic questions, but these are really popular questions that people are engaged in. So this one is a screenshot of me in the video of Alamat, where they actually asked me to, clarify these, this very contested notion of what language is and what a dialect is, especially in the context of the Philippines. And you know, it's fascinating precisely because even in the schools right now, the misconception in general really is that when we're talking about Philippine languages, they are just merely dialects, right? And one of the advocacies actually of Alamat is to, basically to demolish this kind of misconception and, talk about, these Philippine languages as languages themselves, not simply as dialects. Now, um, these misconceptions are not very are in a sense difficult to understand, but at the same time also easy to surface in terms of where they are coming from, because in on the slides here you have a newspaper article on the left, and this was published in actually 1916. This is 1916. This is in the first few years of American colonization in the Philippines. And it says here, really very straightforward, English ousts dialects from the Philippines. So as you can see here, it is English ousting all these Philippine languages from Philippine education as well. Now, I wouldn't dwell much on that here, but I just would like to make the point here that the kinds of conversations that are happening on the ground in the Philippines right now, the kinds of thinking and engagement concerning Philippine languages, and specifically in the context of PPOP, the PPOP communities, right, about regional languages, why the Philippines, while Filipinos do not really, in a sense, value songs in other regional languages other than perhaps just simply Tagalog and English. I just would like to make that point that these are historically framed. These are historically shaped understandings of language and dialects that way back, not just a year ago, way back, not just a decade ago, but even a century ago, the construction of Philippine languages as dialects already began. And as you can see here, I mean, this is just one representative title, of course, but the way colonization has constructed, or in a sense devalued these Philippine languages in favor of English, for example, in order to make sense of or to justify the use of English as the sole medium of instruction. So you can actually then relate it back historically, explain it historically, and later on I will be able to explain to you how even emotions and feelings, therefore, can be very much historicized in that context. So the view outside is, I put it, of course, in inverted commas. It's precisely because, a lot of all these things about language and dialect, all right, may be considered as academic, questions or academic, modes of interrogation. But what I see here really is that if you look at it from the outside, outside the classroom, for example, and here I'm talking about social media, one post by one particular artist can generate thousands and thousands of comments. So it's very difficult to just simply ignore these comments and these communities, because this is where you actually can make sense of what's going on, how they think, how they negotiate meaning, and so on and so forth. So I'm looking at it now here from the outside the classroom and see what do we see outside the classroom and how does it link back, for example, to what we do in the classroom as well. And here, therefore, I talk about teacher knowledge because I would like to make sense of what's going on at this point, in the context of teacher knowledge. As you can see here, much of what we know about teacher knowledge has got something to do with our knowledge, the content. Do we have the content expertise in being able to teach our students what needs to be taught? Pedagogical content knowledge as well, in terms of how do we teach? What are certain strategies? What are certain ways or effective ways? What are certain best practices, for example, in delivering our knowledge? Delivering knowledge, delivering content in our particular courses, in our particular modules. But at the same time, also knowledge of learners. How much do we know about learners? How much do we know about what they know. All right, because knowing more about the learners, knowing more about the pupils who come into our classes, will definitely have a much greater impact on our effectiveness as teachers as well. Now, so these are basically generally, the kinds of teacher knowledge, the categories of teacher knowledge that usually are being put forward in teacher education. But what I would like to, add really is that there's a missing link somewhere. All right. And here are several authors, of course, and several scholars from different fields, if you come to think of it, really try to bring these, pieces and categories of knowledge together. And at the center of which is knowledge of the world. And I think it's in a very, very broad sense, it's knowledge of the world. How much of the world do we really actually know? Of course, here, different scholars would have different takes on what it is meant by knowledge of the world. It's on the one hand, for example, you have Grant and Viturek, for example, really talking about knowledge of political and cultural and historical movements, all right? Because teachers need to know about, all of these, the kinds of activism and the kinds of critical engagements that need to be done in order to, address linguistic and cultural inequities in the classroom. On the other hand, you have other scholars, for example, simply talking about the need, for example, to map out different language teaching cultural contexts of learners. In other words, how do learners learn, in what context, in what cultural context do they learn? Because, learning and teaching, of course, as we know, are very, very cultural in nature as well. So in a sense, you have science as well, and mathematics, scholars asking questions about why, how do we connect, science with the rest of the world? How do we make our children or our pupils, appreciate science more in the context of everyday lives, and so on and so forth. Whatever it is, I think the point really here is that there has to be a certain category of knowledge that's missing in teacher education, and that is, knowledge of the world. How do we get our teachers, and how do we ourselves, as teachers as well, prepare ourselves for teaching by not only being aware of content knowledge, not only being aware of knowledge of learners and pedagogical content, but also knowledge of the world. And that is the reason why here I say that in order to bridge the gap between language and everyday multilingualism, then we need to really firm up our understanding of knowledge of the world. So here we're talking about structure of feeling, in other words, and translingual dispositions. Now, these are, of course, concepts that I am putting forward here in this talk. So I'm not saying that these are the concepts that need to be addressed when talking about knowledge of the world. These are just two examples of how we can make sense of bringing everyday multilingualism and language education, and education in general, together. All right, and constituting, this kind of knowledge of the world that I just talk about. So here, what are structures of feeling, for example, and what are translingual dispositions, and what these mean to us as language teachers or as educators. So let me start with Alamat, for example. Here you have Alamat, singing in 7 local languages. You don't need to read all of these there in the slide, but basically Alamat here is a group that attempts to promote Philippine culture, attempts to promote the use of music. And Philippine textiles, for example, and local fashion, for example, bring it all together, but still connecting with contemporary pop music that's very much in thing or fashionable in the world today. So it's like a fusion of what supposedly are indigenous Filipino music and instruments and histories and stories with the kinds of stories and the kinds of contemporary music that we have at the moment as well. So the core mission is then therefore really to elevate the status of regional languages to the national mainstream. So it's a relatively new group, but it's it's definitely I foresee it to be a growing a very very big group in the next few months as well, especially that they are coming up with their second debut, so their second song, which I would say is very 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 exciting, far more exciting perhaps from than the first song as well. So, how were the discussions? What were some of the discourses that were generated? Out of the first song, out of Alamat, for example. And here, this is where I then started basically really reflecting very, very seriously on these questions about dialects and languages. One thing that you see in not just hundreds but thousands of comments that emerge out of watching their songs and watching some of their videos as well, is the fact that when Filipinos, or a lot of these young ones, even not just young ones, but a lot of Filipinos, when they refer to these languages that are being sung, they refer to them as dialects. And it's interesting that there are some who then try to, in a sense, correct each other and correct each other. No, those are not dialects, those are languages. And that's basically the context of why I was invited by Alamat to explain, in a sense, historically, not just linguistically, but also historically, why Philippine languages are not really dialects. So you can see there, therefore, basically conversations, dialogues, on the ground, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, of Filipinos engage in these kinds of conversations. The interesting point that I would like to bring in, however, here is the fact that aside from cognitive responses, like, oh, now I know what the difference is between language and dialect, so now I understand. All right, there's also the affective part of it. There's also the emotional aspect to it. As you can see here, says something like P-pop, then hearing my own regional language is so satisfying. Then my mother tongue is in the song, I cry waterfalls, right? Solid, na amaze ako. So I felt amazed, it's amazing that I heard my mother tongue in the song. And then, this the music brings in the kilig factor. It's like being giddy and being really very, very excited, but with some bodily movement. Hearing it somehow produces or generates that kind of exciting bodily movement. So that's what is meant by kilig factor. So you see here that the responses are not really just cognitive, are not just simply thinking about, changing one's position on dialects and languages, but here you have immense responses that are very effective and emotional in nature. And this is what I refer to, and I would like to bring this notion forward by as structures of feeling, which is in what Raymond Williams refers to as characteristic elements of impulse, impulse, restraint, and tone, specific effective elements of consciousness. In other words, when you listen to the song, then there's some kind of a response to the song that is very effective, that is very emotional as well. And Joseph Park in 2015 takes up this the notion of structures of feeling in the context, for example, of unequal Englishes, which of course is an area that I also work in. He talks about, when you talk about this notion of structures of feeling, basically about shifting our attention to what is happening on the ground. So what is happening on the ground? So we're not just simply reflecting on, we're not just simply making sense, so to speak, of the intellectual and the cognitive dimensions of responses, but what is exactly happening on the ground. And this is exactly what I have been doing. We're just listening, quote unquote, to conversations and dialogues, and let those dialogues and conversations and those emotions emerge from these conversations as well. He talks about the politicization of seemingly personal and mundane feelings. The idea of structures of feeling basically is that when you're talking about emotions, So when you're talking about your response to a particular, subject matter, and this time to a song sung in a, different regional languages, now these feelings are both personal, but at the same time also political in nature, right? Dimensions of subjectivity do not reside outside of social structure, in other words. Now, I think to put this all in perspective, the idea when you're talking about structures of feeling is that, when we are talking about our own emotional responses to certain things, such as, for example, when Filipinos respond to a particular song and they cry, and the ones that I gave you are not just simply just written responses. Actually, there are a lot of video responses to the songs as well. And these video responses, you see people just simply starting to cry, for example, because they hear, their own language in the song. You hear people like just simply shocked and feeling, overwhelmed by emotion just because they saw or they listened to or they heard, one of the regional languages that they actually speak. So the point here of Williams and Park is that these feelings are both very much personal, but at the same time political, right? And here again, now that's the reason why I want us to refer back to the slide that I gave you earlier, because the kinds of the kinds of responses that we have, when you start crying, this is not something just simply very, very, deep rooted inside. Yes, it is deep rooted inside, but what generated it? What produced it? Because what produced it, of course, are, decades and generations of deprivation, of not being able to hear or listen to, your own regional languages in mainstream music, for example. So you can actually then go back historically to explain that these emotions that you feel, this perhaps on the one hand, anger towards certain languages, or happiness or excitement over hearing certain sounds in certain languages, all of these may be personal and subjective because they are very much deep-rooted inside us. But these are structures. There are structures of feeling because you have history, society, politics, and ideology framing those feelings as well. So you feel that way because history has actually produced that kind of a feeling for you. The next one that I'd like to talk about is, of course, SB19. This is probably some of you will definitely outside the Philippines will most likely have heard of them as well. It is such a huge talented group. There are still going on, and I see them to be doing very, very well in the next few years as well. They are an embodiment of talent over just simply looks. Supposedly they change the discourse on what good, what talent is about. They change the discourse on what entertainment is about, it should be. But I'd like, in this context, I'd like to bring particular attention to one particular instance. This is one of the members of SB19. This is Ken Suson, who is a speaker of Bisaya. Not, of course, of course, he speaks Tagalog, but he is a Bisaya speaker as well, from Mindanao. And in one of those, in one of those times that he is on Twitter, he did a screenshot of a conversation that he had with his dad. So this is a private conversation. We don't need to basically understand what is going on between Ken and his dad here. It's in Visaya mostly, but the point here really is that he actually wanted to share this conversation between his dad about his dad dreaming about Ken being hugely popular, achieving his success, in the entertainment industry as well. And they were also looking back to the past when they were just back in the bukid, in the mountains, when life was just very, very simple. So you can imagine, because you see online, the national language is Tagalog or Filipino, all right, and then you have someone who did a screenshot and basically just that's it, and tweeted about it without any sort of explanation whatsoever. All right. And so most of course, those online wouldn't be able to understand what the conversations are about. So basically, what he did was, okay, this is a screenshot of me and my dad talking, and then that's it, right? Now, what's fascinating to me is what actually came after that. The kinds of discourses and discourses and conversations that emerged after that. And I'm not just simply talking of comments and tweets of in the hundreds. I'm talking in terms of thousands and thousands of comments that emerge out of it, which is really, really fascinating to me. And here I'd like to frame what happened, in the context of this whole notion of translingual dispositions. So earlier I talked about structures of feeling. So here talking about translingual dispositions, which Lee and Janks basically describe as characterized by a general openness to plurality and difference in the ways people use language. So the idea here basically is that what Ken, and for those of you in linguistics, of course, what Ken did was to use a marked form or use of language. It's not something that is expected in that particular context, because Filipinos in that conversation speak different sort of languages. I speak English, I speak Tagalog, but I also speak Hiligaynon, I also speak Aklanon. All right. So the idea is to use the lingua franca, which is generally Tagalog, but sometimes a combination of Tagalog and English. But then there's Bisaya. So he used the marked form of language, which then somewhat generated quite a lot of buzz and conversations. But what happened? All right. So many things happened. First of all, what happened was that, of course, the most immediate was that the Bisaya speakers translated the text for everyone to read. Then the non-Bisaya speakers, tweeted and asked, so can someone please help explain? Can someone please help translate? And so on and so forth. Some people went to the point of, looking for people they knew. It could be their parents, it could be their mom or dad, or their boyfriend or girlfriend or best friends who were speakers of Bisaya. So they went out of the way to ask for this translation. Now, in the conversations as well, online, there were also certain exchanges of cultural notes, because there were actual differences. Even the Bisaya speakers, because they come from different regions in the Philippines as well. There's Bisaya speakers in Cebu, in the Visayas. There's also Bisaya speakers in Mindanao. All right. So there are bound to be different, certain words that are culturally different from one another. So when the translations actually emerge, there were certain changes in the differences of choice of words, right? So it actually generated some kinds of cultural exchanges, that were generated by these kinds of conversations. And interestingly, also some, like for example, as an Aklanon, I don't speak Bisaya, but if I have to look at it very closely, I would most likely be familiar with some of the words. So what happened was those online, what they did was they drew on their knowledge of Philippine languages. So I drew on my own knowledge of Aklanon in order to make connections with Bisaya. So I tried using my own knowledge of my other languages, Philippine languages, to somehow make sense of the general content of the conversations of Ken and his dad. So the idea here basically is that when you're talking, so what we see here are really translingual, an exemplar of translingual dispositions. These are ways of speaking and thinking and doing which embrace rather than reject all forms of linguistic difference. What does this mean? This means that there were certain negotiations of meaning that happened. There were certain translations, but which generated spaces for intercultural negotiation. Meaning, like there were people, saying, okay, that's not what it means in my context. That's not what it means in my regional variety, and so on and so forth. And something that is really very interesting and should be emphasized is the fact that these different languages, in a sense, really did not serve as barriers to communication. Because you see, when people were talking about barriers to communication, it has much to do with not just simply linguistic barrier, but also attitudinal barriers as well. all right? And what we see here is that, yes, there were initially linguistic barriers, but because the attitudes were very open, so content surfaced, and then everyone started to, engage, productively in the conversation. And here you have, in other words, what we saw in translingual dispositions, that were, present in the comments, in the conversations that were generated by that kind of language use. Basically, just to put this all together, it's really just that despite the use of different languages, communication continued. Despite, initial problems with, understanding each other, there was a lot of drive towards trying to understand each other. So negotiation of meaning um, sometimes does not happen, because we really just refuse to deal with people. It's not so much about communicating linguistically, but the attitudes, in other words, here may need to change. Now, what this means is that in a lot of contexts, in the classroom, we usually blame students. We should usually blame pupils, when they turn silent and not being communicative. All right, so we try to figure out, what can be done in order to make them speak, in order to make them talk, what can be done to get people to engage with one another. But you have, scholars such as Subtir Lu in 2014 basically saying that no, actually, when you're talking about willingness to communicate, you're talking about language ideology mediating the speaker's willingness to communicate. So if speakers have a deficit view of language, for example, that this person that I'm talking to is someone who is not worthy of being talked to because his or her speech is bad accent, so to speak, then I'm not going to talk to this person. So it's not so much about I don't understand, but I just don't like the accent because I don't like the person. All right. So there's the deficit ideology that that is present in one's, lack of willingness to communicate, in other words. So when we're talking, therefore, of multilingualism and translingual dispositions, we're talking basically of multilingualism not really as a problem. So I keep on harping on this. Of course, that line alone cannot solve all the problems of linguistic inequalities, but I think we need to start somewhere by, changing our lens concerning multilingualism and looking at multilingualism as a resource, not really as a problem. So what do we see? Here's what I try to bring back, the visualization of what I said earlier. I've shared with you about how to bridge the gap, about the knowledge of the world. All right. In the context of structures of feeling, for example, and in the context of translingual dispositions. So if these constitute our knowledge of the world, for example, how do we bridge the gap between language education and everyday multilingualism? So on the one hand, you have, what you may call the additive pedagogy. It's pedagogy that adds languages, but does not subtract languages. A lot of, for example, in the context of English language teaching, a lot of pedagogies and a lot of practices have got something to do with subtractive pedagogies. In other words, do away with all the languages that our students actually bring along with them. It's just English and English and English alone. So here we see that, when you talk about structures of feelings, of how people are emotionally involved in their own, language use that are historically produced, that people actually have a much more embracive attitude towards, different languages. Then all of these redound to or go back to, this question of additive, pedagogy. Translingual pedagogy, of course, would then bring us to the perception and the use of the communicative and linguistic repertoires of our students, and look at them not as problems, look at them not as those that interfere in the learning of whatever language we are teaching them, but those that can help facilitate the learning of the language of the class, or help facilitate the content of the class as well. I have quite a number of things here. So, for example, in terms of teacher education, you have embracive attitudes and compensatory practices. In other words, we cannot just simply look at like our students' silences, our students' problems, so-called problems and challenges in communicating. But we look then, therefore, of historically conditioned feelings and silences in the classroom. So perhaps these students come into the classroom because they bring along with them culturally loaded, ideologically loaded, and historically shaped ideologies and experiences of marginalization. So the idea here, therefore, is that we need to have a much larger lens when we are talking about issues of language learning in the classroom as well. So we're talking about compensatory practices. How do we compensate, therefore, for the kinds of marginalized experiences that our students are experiencing in that sense? Some of these, of course, are more specific strategies like conceptual scaffolding. These are all products of what I've observed in my own research back in Singapore, in the Singapore classrooms where I live and stayed basically for 20 years. So I had research projects with the Ministry of Education. I have research projects with local institutions as well. And the use of linguistic repertoires in a range of translingual repertoires, for example, can be strategically used to facilitate the learning of English, for example, or to facilitate the learning of another language, right? So, for example, in the context of conceptual scaffolding, where you aid the pupil to understand certain concepts using the languages or the linguistic repertoires that he or she are familiar with, until such time that halfway through the semester, halfway through the year, for example, you will then be able to understand. They will then be able to make use of whatever language that they are bound to learn in that particular classroom, and so on and so forth. There are many others, as you can see, but yeah. So I'm giving a few minutes for question and answer. So, but the idea here is, I think this is a visual representation, I think, right, or I believe, I hope so, of how we can actually bridge language and everyday language education and education in general and everyday multilingualism. And it is through the lens of knowledge of the world. How we need to have a much firmer and more theoretically strong and firm knowledge of the world, and this time through, for example, our understanding of structures of feelings, the emotions that are produced, when people respond to languages, for example, and the kinds of embracive attitudes that are very much present in everyday multilingualism, and what this means, for example, for language education. All right, so I'm ready. So thank you very much for coming, and then I hope to be able to respond to your questions if you have some. Thank you. Yeah. Hello? Okay, yeah. Can you hear me now, staff? Yeah.
Are we good to go? Yes, all right. Thank you. I'm back.
Okay.
Rani, I hope you can hear me, and I hope everyone can hear me now. Yes. So sorry about that. We had slight technical problem there. Yeah, I was going to say that. Thank you very much for sharing. And I really, I appreciate it coming from Malaysia, coming from a multilingual background. Really appreciate the fact that you've highlighted how multilingualism really is a resource. It's not something, something deficient. Sometimes education, sometimes policies make us feel like we're somewhat deficient. And also you've shown how just through the songs, how it can evoke so many levels of emotions in people when we hear, the languages that are not considered as mainstream in the songs. And more importantly, from a research point of view, from education point of view, you've given us, you've shown us a framework, for us to look at the structure of feelings, and how we respond to languages that we hear. And so really, really appreciate the fact that you've also shown us how we can actually bridge the gap between what's out there, in terms of multilingualism and the classroom, because often we ignore this resource that we have. And I think it's a good reminder to all of us educators at whichever level we are, not to ignore the fact that we ourselves and many of the students in our classes are actually multilinguals, and so I think we should definitely take that on. So without going on too much, so thank you, Rani, and I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to address to you. And the first one is from Ambrin, and it's a bit long, so I'll try and break it up. But basically, Ambrin is asking, what should a teacher do in case of a context where there is a conflict already present in a system of education about the choice of medium of instruction, where one language is considered superior and the other inferior, and regional languages are not considered as part of the education system. So how would a teacher, how would students deal with multilingualism in such a kind of I guess, a negative context, Rani?
Well, it's pretty much a description of all classrooms in the world.
Yes.
Although some classrooms probably would be more, I mean, we would be able to highlight those issues more in some and not in the others. But I guess in classrooms, most classrooms around the world, is in multilingual contexts, we really see always, a hierarchy of languages. The values that are differently done, associated with different languages. So I guess, again, drawing on from my own research, basically, we can't, from the point of view of the teachers, I know, that I worked in Singapore for 20 years. But so from the outside, there's really nothing much that we can do individually as teachers, in terms of language policy. But what I've seen inside the classroom is that there are a lot of, practices of resistance and transformative practices that are also going on that teachers, for example, are doing. So, for example, even the choice of text, like for example with Singlish, because I worked, for example, on the use of Singlish in the teaching of English in these 6 classrooms, and that there are a lot of problematic perceptions of what Singlish is, especially in the context of the classroom. But teachers do a lot of things, for example, making sense of how contrastive analysis, for example, like in this more standard kind of English, this is how you can write, and in Singlish, this is how it is written. All right, and research has shown, not just in my own research, but research, for example, on in other contexts as well of Pidgin English, that when students and pupils are able to say aloud that in my language we say this, and in that language we say this, all right, there is a lot of learning going on. All right, so we don't need to deal with language policy, in a broad macro scale, but inside the classroom, I think there's so much that we can do.
Empowering teachers as well, and this relates to another question asked, because a lot of the time and the like his raised race. And so the question is, like, of what would you suggest operate in teacher education? Often I don't think a lot of teacher education activity. How
Steph, I cannot hear you.
can't hear me again? Okay.
Yeah.
Hang on. Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Lower, but yeah, it's just clearer than earlier. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Better? Okay.
Yeah.
Right, right. I think it's the leveling. So sorry. I agree with you that about what you said, that at the end of the day, we may not be able to effect change policy-wide, but as teachers in the classroom, there's a lot we can do. And this relates to another question about teacher education, because I think in many teacher education programs around the world, even where there is like widespread multilingualism, there often it's not touched upon in teacher education, in teacher training. So, do you have any suggestions as to how, we can incorporate this kind of training in the use of multilingual resources in the classroom? So, talking about teacher education here.
Yeah. One thing that I hope you can hear me. Yeah?
Yes,
One thing
yes.
that one thing that I have learned from research in this particular area is that there's a lot of research interrogating, for example, problematic practices in the classroom.
Mm,
There's a lot of work that has much to do with questioning, for example, subtractive attitudes, among teachers, among educators, and so on. And this also translates to what is happening, in teacher education. However, um, what teacher education needs, all right, are far more ways that actually concretize what can be done. Because when, like, even I myself, for example, if I haven't been in these classrooms that I researched for quite a number of years, everything would be very, very abstract to me. I can talk about, yeah, multilingualism is a resource, multilingual is a resource, but exactly how does it translate to pedagogies, for
yeah,
example? So one would be, as what I said earlier, would be something that has got to do with contrastive analysis, where you
right.
actually bring in, the languages that their students actually have with them, and let them compare certain structures with the structures that they learn, for example, in an English classroom, and therefore surface that kind of knowledge and so
Yep.
on for teacher educators as well. One of the things that I have also been involved in is in the use of multicultural picture books, for example,
Yeah.
multicultural bilingual books. So in other words, I think what is important is not just simply helping us ourselves and our teachers and our educators together interrogate all these practices, but how do these things now translate to practice?
Yes.
That is where that is where things are not yet very, very clear at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I hope now you can hear me, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie. Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. We can talk about policy all we want, but policy changes take forever. But classroom practices is where teachers can make a difference. But I think it needs to also be incorporated into teacher education so that teachers are not, are made aware of these things, and but they do have to grapple, and that's a question that many people have asked. They will have to grapple with the tensions even within the
Yes.
classroom, because the head teacher or the head of department might say, why are you bringing these things into the classroom? Why are you allowing multilingualism? And just to bring, and I think we're at
Steph,
our
Steph,
last question. Yes, we're
Steph,
at our
just
last question. Yes, sorry.
no, just something I
Yeah,
remember that
yeah, yeah.
kept on
No,
coming
go ahead.
back every time I would and interview teachers, is that
Yeah,
they would always say something like, well, so I ask, so what if your supervisor is around? So,
yeah.
well, I show them what they want lah, but when they're not around, then I do whatever I
Absolutely.
want.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We actually have a nice example in some of the schools here, especially with one particular school that has indigenous children, and how they use the indigenous language in the landscape of the school. But I'll have that conversation with you some other time. I'll just move on
Yeah.
to the last question. We do have some questions, other questions, but in the interest of time, I'll just move on to one question that's asking, about. So we talked about in the class, we talked about out there, the real world, and where multilingualism is rife and rich and dynamic. And then we talked about how we can bring it into the classroom and use it as a resource. Now, how about in terms of now the output of our research? And the question is, in the light of academia, reading and writing, but particularly in our publications, which is so English centric. So how can multilingualism, translingualism, or translingual pedagogy be promoted while empowering the students to participate in academic discourse, which is often in the sort of mainstream languages, especially English. So, do you have any maybe examples or suggestions as to how we can overcome this barrier? Because academic discourse is also very, very mostly English centric, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely. I think that's a reality that we
Yeah.
are all dealing with, definitely. So
Yeah.
it's very difficult to contend with.
Yeah.
But being, for example, in a associate editor of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language, for
Mm.
example, all right, and that is where I think translingual dispositions really, as a concept, come into the picture. Because when you're talking about translingual dispositions, you're not really just simply talking about, number of languages that you use, the
Yes.
number of languages that you speak. It's really more about how you embrace, how you generate embracive attitudes towards,
Yes.
not just languages, but
Yeah.
different ways of writing as well.
Yeah.
So we are very much keen on, for example, expanding, the different ways of writing, for example, not just in that academic the so-called mainstream academic way. So I think if you've seen, you have essays now,
Yeah.
basically, in the first two issues of the journal, if not mistaken, essays coming from all the members of the board, just essays, not
Yeah.
not the kinds of, like, you have a
Yeah.
research project and so on and so forth, right? And some of them we allowed, if they want them to translate to in their own languages, they can do so as well. I mean, these are small steps, but I think the point here really is that we just don't have to think of it in terms of just simply languages, in
Yeah.
terms also of rhetorical differences,
Yes.
or, academic, in terms of academic ways of writing as well. So it's being able to be open to different ways of writing, for example, and other sources of knowledge and texts, which are not just simply Western in orientation.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to hear that about the journal that you are now the editor of. And I think there's also is something that we need to be aware of in the classroom when we have, students coming from different language backgrounds, but also different cultural backgrounds, and
Mm,
the way that they write. Because often we are like some reviewers of, very rather intolerant of certain styles and certain ways of well, articulating thinking, because we're so fixed into a particular way, which we don't realize maybe is because of the mainstream language. So Ruani, thank you so much. I know many people have tons of questions to ask you, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna have to say thank you very much for
thank you.
joining us, and thank you to everybody that's joined us. We've had like hundreds of people joining us from all over the world in learning about everyday multilingualism and language education and how we bridge the gap. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a great day. Ronnie, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.